Today we're going to have a look at four different types of narrative styles or genres: fairy tales, folk tales, legends, and myths. Don't be surprised if the definitions and characteristics of these genres overlap, because they do, they definitely do. But we're going to try and characterize the feeling of each one and give examples as well. So let's start with a fairy tale. So this is a narrative that includes magic and fantasy. It has creatures that we don't find or we don't seem to find in everyday life. And there's normally a struggle between good and evil, and there's often a lesson to be learned. So I'm sure you've probably come across some stories called Cinderella, Snow White, Little Red Riding Hood as well. Let's look deeper at what the characteristics are. So, as we said, magical elements, witches, fairies, fantasies, like castles in faraway countries. The characters are normally very clearly good or very clearly bad. As we said, there's a lesson to be learned. And there's normally a happy ending to these stories. We go through trials, but then we reach a positive goal. So the story will typically begin with once upon a time and end with they lived happily ever after. And there's often symbolism in these stories to represent the fight between good and evil, or purity, or perseverance. So, for example, in the story of Cinderella, when she goes to the ball, she wears beautiful clothes which match her internal purity. And when the prince is looking to find her again, he has only her glass slipper, and that glass slipper only fits his princess. So it also symbolizes purity, but also her unique identity and the ability of the prince to identify her. So the themes that are explored in these fairy tales are timeless. They're true for all times. Can you see the frog and the prince? Do you know that fairy tale? Have you come across that one? The frog prince that is transformed from an ugly frog into a handsome prince. So transformation is another element of fairy tales. An important consideration is the fact that the fairy tale is a genre associated with Western literature, with European literature. Okay, so it has European roots. The root of the word, where the word comes from, is from the French conte des fées, which is like the story of fairies. Yes, so there are overlapping characteristics with folk tales, but there's an emphasis on fantasy and magical creatures. And yes, each culture does have its own kind of fairy tale, definitely. Here are some examples of fairy tales that you can look at later. You just stop the slide and have a look at it. Cinderella, which is a summary of the story with the themes. Snow White, Little Red Riding Hood. Now we're going to look at folk tales. This is a story passed down orally from generation to generation, a traditional story based on superstition. Let's look at that word, superstition. It normally has a negative connotation, excessively credulous belief in and reverence for the supernatural. So yes, the kind of, it's sort of like a negative description. I don't know whether it's fair to describe folk tales as superstitious or in a negative way. So let's keep that in mind. Here are some characteristics. They pass down through the generations orally, and there's a focus on the culture from which this folk tale originates. Okay, so it's part of the culture's history. It's very rich in values and figures that represent that culture. It may have a simple plot structure. There's also moral lessons. There are also universal themes, good versus evil. And yes, the characters, the hero, the villain, like in the fairy tale, perhaps a bit more complex. The genre of folk tales is probably a bit broader than fairy tales, one can argue. There are also supernatural elements. There are repetitive patterns. Yes, three attempts, three siblings, although one also finds this in fairy tales. Normally, these folk tales are so old that we don't know the author. So they're so old that they were originally passed down orally before they were written down. And they also have symbolism. So you can see there are a lot of similarities. Um, this is just putting their characteristics together, but now we can see if we try to compare the two. There's a focus on culture with folktale. I mean, there's also an implicit culture of Western European um, origins for fairy tales. Perhaps if the Western culture is dominant, then we see this as the outer or the less dominant culture. So remember that these all words are from the perspective of a particular culture. So the folk tale has cultural roots. It is sometimes a bit more realistic. Uh, so the category is a little bit broader, a little bit more flexible, as they say here. Um, so the key differences: magical versus realistic, specific versus broad. Fairy tales have stereotypical characters, like really good or really bad, while folk tales have a bit more complexity, perhaps. The purpose of fairy tales is to give a moral lesson. Um, yes, and again, they stressing that folk tales are a broader category. These are examples of African folk tales. Anansi the spider, why the sun and moon live in the sky. See, this folk tale explains the origin of the sun and the moon. Okay. So let's look at legends now. I'm not sure that this definition is really going to help us a lot, but of course it's a story that is passed down. And here are some examples. Let's look a bit closer. So there's a historical element to a legend, okay? It has elements of myth and folklore. It's also passed down, and it's again part of the cultural heritage. So let's think of legend as a way of telling history in an exciting way. Okay, it always has a big hero. It has villains as well, bad characters, but there's a very strong hero that does justice or good. There are also supernatural elements. There are also lessons. Of course, there's a cultural significance. Of course, it was passed down orally. Again, there's symbolism, the stress on the community. And yes, certain elements of the history are exaggerated to make them a compelling story. So it's this combination, exciting combination of telling history in uh, a magical way that makes the heroes, seem all powerful as well. So here are some examples. King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table. What an exciting legend that is. And what is the magical element in King Arthur? When he draws the sword out of a stone, which means that he alone is the worthy king to be. So a bit like Cinderella. The shoe only fits her. Only King Arthur can draw the sword out of the stone. Let's have a look at myths now. These are stories that provide explanations for things that affect us every day. Okay, so for example, how did the world begin? In the Bible, we have a story of creation, but myths do the same thing. They explain how our world began, how the universe began. So there's an explanation, but usually the characters belong to the world of the gods or the world of the supernatural beings, okay? So they're not really earthly. They also, of course, have lessons about good and evil, as we will see. So here we see, again, supernatural uh, beliefs and values of a particular culture. Yes, each culture has its own myths, its own deep way of explaining its universe, its world. And it's part of the collective consciousness of a society. Yes, so you may not be aware of these myths, but they form part of your own culture. Here are some characteristics: explains natural phenomena, supernatural elements, sacred and cultural significance, cosmology, yes, how the universe began. Um, we said that they talk about gods, but they give these gods human qualities so that we can understand them. So these gods are all powerful, heroic, they are lessons, universal or timeless themes, of course, they'll always be relevant. They use symbolism and allegory, they are passed down orally, they reflect the culture, and yes, they definitely do occur in otherworldly, in heavenly, godly realms. So if we compare the two myths and legends, you can stop this slide and have a look at the differences to help you understand. Legends are more historical, remember? Myths are explaining all important things about cosmology, about how the universe was created. Um, the myths are more about sacred knowledge, more a spiritual dimension, I think, because all the characters belong to a heavenly realm. They are even more powerful than the historical figures that we read about in legends. And the themes reflect what we've just said. The setting is also, for a myth, it's otherworldly, ancient, but in a legend, it's real, it's part of our history. So these are the key differences. As we've said, history versus cosmology, human versus divine, secular, which means everyday reality belonging to our world, versus sacred, realistic versus otherworldly.